Well, Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5 kind of continues this look at the subject of pride. If you remember last week when we looked at King Nebuchadnezzar and how God took him low and to the point where he looked up and saw God as God and he yielded himself to him. So we saw God's mercy through pride. And, this morning we look at a little different way of looking at pride and what happens to pride if it doesn't yield to God. So that's what we're going to be looking at this morning in Daniel chapter 5. Now, between Daniel chapter 5, and if you look at the way Daniel chapter 5 opens, it opens and it says, King Belshazzar. And you're like, who is this? What happened to King Nebuchadnezzar? Well, I want to kind of fill in that gap because to understand chapter 5 of Daniel, we need to understand what's happened and understand some of these characters and what's going on historically throughout this time, because all these things are all chronicled in history, in the history books, and we can see them happening. So here's what happens. Daniel chapter 4 ends, and it's right near the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and again, everything's restored to him, and Nebuchadnezzar's reign ends in prosperity and in peace. It's a good thing. And in 562 BC, Nebuchadnezzar dies. So he reigned for 43 years as king, the longest monarch in this section of the Babylonian Empire. And what follows the death of Nebuchadnezzar is about 6 years of a power struggle for who's going to take over. Nebuchadnezzar has a son. He came to power, but he was kind of overthrown. And there's these other guys that are rising up wanting to be king or wanting to have power until this one guy, Nabonidus, seizes power and takes the throne in Babylon. And Nabonidus, of all things, is the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nabonidus he's most likely married to one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And he ascends to the throne in 556 BC. Now, Nabonidus, he's a pretty good king as far as kings go. Now, he's not godly at all, but he's a pretty good king, and he's peaceful. He's not a warrior, so he's not out doing conquests or anything like that. So under him, the empire is pretty peaceful. There's one interesting thing about Nabonidus, though, is that he's originally from Arabia. Again, he married into the family, and he's from Arabia, or to the south of where Babylon is, in the desert in Saudi Arabia. And he loved it there. So most of his reign, he spent not in Babylon, but rather back in Arabia. So he's kind of almost absent. And so while he was away, he placed authority to rule in the hands of his son, a guy named Belshazzar, who I guess he made kind of a co-regent, or he was number 2 man. He says, when I'm not here, you rule as king. So that's why we see the name King Belshazzar. And previously in history, people said this is why Daniel isn't true, because there's no mention of King Belshazzar in any of the history. Until 1854, they found this cylinder that had the history of Nabonidus written on it. And it talks all about this with Belshazzar. So we know he's a historical figure, and he did serve as ruler in Babylon in the place of Nabonidus when he was not there. So he functioned like them. Now, 25 years have now passed between the death of King Nebuchadnezzar and where chapter 5 opens. And what happens in that time is the Medo-Persian Empire rises up as a major power in the world. Now, Persia, if Babylon is located where modern-day Iraq is, Persia is where Iran is. And then the nation of Media, or the region of Media, is even further north and west of there, up near the Caspian Sea. And so that's where the Medo-Persians come from, and they begin conquering lands and grabbing power. And in September of 539 BC, they actually meet the Babylonian army outside the city of Opis, which is about 50 miles north of the city of Babylon. And there in that battle, the Babylonian army is decimated. Pretty much ceased to be a fighting force in the world. And now King Cyrus of Persia now has moved down, and he's right outside the city of Babylon. So this is where we have the setting. Now, we open up in verse 1. King Belshazzar, in light of all this, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of 1,000. So as an army sits at his gates, how do you respond to that? How would you respond? Well, Belshazzar, he doesn't put his time into defending the city. He doesn't send people out to negotiate peace. He says, you know what we'll do? We'll have a party. Isn't that a great way to respond to tension and danger? So this is because Belshazzar is filled with pride, right? And he's either in denial of what's about to happen, or he's very overconfident. He says, I'm king. Who's going to come against us? And also, I'm confident because who's going to take Babylon? So in light of that, he says, so we're just going to have a party. We'll show, and I'll show that I have control. And so even in light of this, we'll have a party. And this party is really more of a drunken orgy. If you picture a bad, wild party, this is even worse. Okay? It's horrible. And usually when you have these feasts, you would dedicate it to the Babylonian gods. And that's what's going on here. And they're having this huge party. In fact, the banquet room where it was held, it was bigger than this room. It was about 150 feet by 50 feet. So you could put 1,000 people in it. And on one end, they excavated and found that there was a nook in it where a throne would sit elevated above the rest of the room for a king. And the walls were made of plaster, just as we find here in this story today, as we'll read. So they're there. So despite the army being defeated, Belshazzar here, he says, we're untouchable. We have nothing to fear. Now, in a sense, that's pretty well founded. Do you remember last week when we talked about the city of Babylon? The city of Babylon is a fortress. Remember, 300-foot-high walls, 14 miles long on each side. The walls are 50 feet thick. Who is going to be able to go through those walls or over those walls? Not only that, do you remember how we talked about the river Euphrates, how Nebuchadnezzar diverted the river Euphrates and it went under the walls and went through the city? So now they have an endless supply of fresh water to drink. And because of that, they have a lot of vegetation there, so they have a lot to eat. So it's basically the city of Babylon is siege-proof. They can last a long time, especially longer than an army who's sitting outside in the middle of a desert. So he's got reason in himself to say, we're going to be okay. And we're siege-proof. So during this party, what we find is that Belshazzar, he's getting more and more inebriated, and he's starting to get loose in what he's doing. And what he says is, you know what? This wine is pretty good, but it'll be better if we go and get those items that my grandfather took from Jerusalem from the temple. You remember those beautiful gold goblets and things like that from the temple? Let's get them and we'll drink out of them. So that's what he wants to do. We'll talk about desecrating or dishonoring God. But yet, this is what he says to do. And verse 4 says, and then they brought the golden vessels, and they had taken out of the temple the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they took that which was dedicated to the Most High God, and they dishonored it by drinking in honor of their gods, their dead gods. And much like last week, you remember when Nebuchadnezzar sat on the rooftop of the palace and he started speaking out in pride? Well, this prideful act, God takes action right away. In fact, look at verse 5. Immediately, as they started to do this and dishonor God, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. So, picture this. Now, I'm sure you've heard of this, right? But have you ever tried to picture this? That it's not like this whole arm or anything. It's just a hand with fingers. Comes out of the sky, almost Monty Python-esque, right? And I often think, what did this hand look like if everybody's singing? I picture a giant hand. Now, we're not told it's a giant hand, but you know what? We're going to call it a giant hand. And this giant hand then comes, and it begins to write on the plaster wall right next to the throne, because that's where the lampstands were, right? To bring light into the room, but also to light up the throne. And so where he's sitting in his most prideful, and right next to that, this finger appears, and it hovers over the party, and it begins to write. And imagine what's happening here. You know, the party's going, the music's blasting, everybody's having fun, and then all of a sudden somebody notices it, and they're like, huh? And then more people notice, and all of a sudden the music stops, and the hush falls over the crowd, and the king's like, what's everybody looking? And then he turns around and he looks, and he sees this hand writing something on the wall. And as soon as this king sees it, he's terrified. In fact, in verse 6, it describes it. It says his face turned color. You know what that means? He turned white with fear. He flushes out, right? And it says his knees shake, and it says his hips give way, or his limbs give way. It literally says his hips give way. Do you know what that means? Here's what that means in a nutshell. His bowels became loose. Do I need to describe it further? Okay, good. So he's sitting here looking at this, white as a ghost, knees shaking, almost falling down, and he defecates himself, and he's standing there. Imagine that fear. Now imagine this king, in all of his pride, wanting to show how great he is, and now is standing there, scared as could be. And while Belshazzar, he might not know what this message is exactly, and it's a message from God. While he might not know what the message is, God is speaking, unlike the useless gods that they're worshiping, that are dead. So the message that's written can't be good. In fact, have you ever heard the expression, I can see the writing on the wall? That's where this comes from. And usually when you say, hey, I could see the writing on the wall, it's usually something ominous, right? It's usually something not good. That's why. So he sees this writing on the wall, and he says, this can't be good. You see, Belshazzar hadn't learned from the patience of God, that God had been patient with him even over the last, 20 years or so that he's been there. And he had doubled down on his pride and his rebellion against God. And he knew deep down this couldn't be good. You see, even though Belshazzar, he isn't faithful to God, do you know what, by this handwriting on the wall, we see? That God is faithful. In fact, this is a theme not only here in chapter 5, but it's throughout Daniel, is the faithfulness of God. That's kind of the theme here. As God's people then live as strangers in a strange land, as they're brought into Babylon, God shows himself faithful over and over again. And you know what? That's something we need to know. It's something we need to realize and something we need to trust as we live in our world today. Because our world, you watch the news, it's ever worsening, isn't it? It's getting ever more antagonistic and prideful in self. And we say, how do we stand up as a follower of Jesus in our world today? Well, here's how we do. We need to know that God is always faithful. So even where sin and evil is triumphing, we can understand and we can trust that God is faithful. In fact, from our passage here, we learn our first thing that even in the midst of great rebellion against God, we can learn, first of all, that God faithfully exposes hearts. You see, this is what gives us faith in living in our world today, where evil seems unleashed. We need to realize that people won't get away with it because God will expose it. And God will expose the hearts of people. Do you know that? God calls out here Belshazzar's bluff of thinking he's in control, or his rebellion against God. You see, sin will never satisfy anyone, and it will naturally get worse and worse. But do you know what else sin will do? Sin will eat away at those who sin, because sin destroys. Lies will become less sensical. You won't do things that make sense anymore. You'll keep doing, and you'll try to explain yourself and all of these things. This is why people that live in their sin and where sin reigns in their life, why most of the time people who are deep in sin are angry. Have you ever noticed that? We notice that in certain lifestyles. We see people that shout their lifestyle and say, this is a great thing, but they're angry, and they do it angrily, right? Or people who know they're right, or people that want to just create chaos that we're seeing today, and they shout it louder and louder, right? And they want to let everybody know, hey, we're angry about this. Do you know why? Because we're all created with a conscience. We're all created with a knowledge of God, so that when we rebel against him, deep down, everyone is terrified that we'll someday be exposed. Let you look a little different at those people around you that you look down on and say, I can't believe they're sinning. They're awful. They're evil. But you know what? They're scared. Those who are stuck in sin, deep down, are scared. Just like Belshazzar here. This is why our natural tendency when we sin and when everybody sins is to hide that sin. We don't want people to know about our sin. So we try to hide it. We try to do it where it can't be seen. But then it deepens and it begins to be exposed. And you know what happens? It'll start to tear us apart. So you know how we respond to that? You know how people respond to that? They try to make their sin sound okay. No, this is a good thing. No, it has to be accepted. You know why? Because when we sin, it's not enough that we just get to sin and we're allowed to. We want people to affirm it because, again, we think something's wrong with it deep down too. So we want people to affirm it. Do you see that today in our world where people involved in certain lifestyles, and they sit there and say, not only do you need to accept us, but you need to celebrate us because what we're doing is good. This is what sin does. And we see that here with Belshazzar. You see, we can't live in rebellion against God for too long before we're going to try to suppress God and those who follow him. Because we will always fear him and being exposed. This is why those in sin and even in our society today are working so hard to take God out of society and silence people who follow God. Because as long as there's a God, there's a reminder that what I'm doing, I can't do. Because there are some rules. And that's why it's such a big deal. In fact, this is what Romans talks about. Paul in Romans, he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature. Again, we can see in nature, and we can also know in ourselves that we have a conscience, how we have a conscience that God places in there, that they're clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that no one is without excuse. It's something that no matter how far down we go in sin, we can't escape it. So you want to know why people oppose God in society so bad? Is because if there's a God, then their actions mean something. And this is what we have. But God is faithful to expose that. And he will one day expose it. He doesn't expose our hearts when we're opposed to him to drive us away, though. That's not why he does it. He does it so that we're forced to deal with him, the one who holds life and our ways in his hands, as he talks about in verse 23. You see, God faithfully exposing our hearts isn't an act of hatred of God to make us feel bad. It's his act of mercy. And he's showing that here with Belshazzar, even in this judgment. So anyway, back to the story. While the king, he suspects that the writing on the wall isn't good, but he still doesn't know what it means. Now, possibly he can't read it because he's so drunk, or possibly it's written in a different language, or whatever. You know, I can't imagine God having bad handwriting, so we can kind of take that out. But it might be written in Hebrew or something like that, but he doesn't know. So it says he loudly calls out. Again, he's trying to show he's in control here. And he calls out and asks for all of his wise men, the Chaldeans, the astrologers, all of these enchanters and things like that. Now, you would think that kings in Babylon would know not to call these guys anymore, right? They've proven themselves pretty useless. Every time they're called to interpret something, they can't. Yet he calls them. He's a little desperate at this point. And he calls them in and he says, can you read this and interpret it? If you can, I will give you riches and honor. In fact, I'll make you third in command of the whole empire. Again, he's second. Nabonidus is first, he says, you can be right behind us. And guess what? To no one's surprise, these guys can't do it. They say, we don't know what it means. So now he's starting to panic even more. And word reaches the queen mother. It says word reaches the queen. We know this isn't his wife because his wife is at the party. Remember, all his wives and concubines are at the party? So it says word reaches the queen. This is talking about the queen mother, or Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. She remembers, hey, my father had a wise man. In fact, he called him a friend, in whom the Spirit of God dwelled. And my father made him chief of all the wise men. Because, in verse 12, it says, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this guy named Daniel, whom my dad called Belteshazzar. And then she goes, so let Daniel be called, and he'll show you the interpretation. Once again, Daniel's called in. Now, why Daniel didn't come in with the wise men? There's a couple thoughts on this. One is, by this time, Daniel's in his 80s. So he may be retired at this point, not doing as much. And it's also possible with Belshazzar, being a young guy, he wants all his young wise men around him. So they kind of just ignore Daniel and let him go and do his thing, but they never call him. So anyway, Belshazzar says, okay, I'll do this. And he greets Daniel, and he offers him again, says, can you read this and interpret this? If you can, I will give you riches, and I'll give you honor. You'll be the third ruler in the kingdom, if you can interpret this. Verse 17, it says, then Daniel answered the king and said before him, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Keep your gifts. I don't need them. I don't want them. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. So again, Daniel can't be bought. And he doesn't share God's message for the praise of men. This is a great lesson for us, isn't it, in our world today? We're not to share God's message to be popular. That's not why we do it. We share God's message because it's God's message. God's message can change lives. This is why we're doing it. So Daniel, he basically says, I'll interpret this writing and God will be honored. But first, let me tell you something first. So before he even does this, he says, let me tell you a little story. And Daniel shares, and he says, you remember your father, your grandfather, really? It says, remember your father because it's in the line of succession, so usually they said father, but it's his grandfather. You remember your father Nebuchadnezzar, right? He was given his power and majesty and authority by God. And I'll tell you what, he was much bigger and better than you. In fact, he says, Nebuchadnezzar had all of this power and might and majesty, and whom he wanted to kill, he killed, and who he wanted to keep alive, he kept alive. He held men's lives in their hands. This is how much power Nebuchadnezzar had. And he's basically telling Belshazzar, he's even much greater than you. But know this, his power was given to him by God. And when Nebuchadnezzar started thinking it was about himself, he became prideful. God humbled him, and he tells him the story again. He went out, he became crazy, went out in the fields, ate grass on all fours, all these things, until he recognized that God is over all the affairs of men. Until Nebuchadnezzar yielded himself, what we talked about last week, right? Till he recognized that God was in charge and worthy of worship. And we also know in this story that God restored Nebuchadnezzar, didn't he? He said he gave him even more than he had before. And he blessed Nebuchadnezzar when he finally yielded himself to God. And this is something that Belshazzar should have known about, right? It's his grandfather. You know your family history. You know what happens with pride. And you also know what happens when you yield yourself with God. Yet, instead of learning from that, you're continuing to rebel against God. And you're dishonoring him. And with this in mind, I'll interpret it. But even in this, as Daniel shares this with him, and he confronts Belshazzar, we learn that in the midst of great rebellion against God, we learn something else about God's faithfulness. Not only is he faithful to expose our hearts, but he also faithfully shows us the way. He shows us the way out. He shows us the way that we don't have to live in sin, that we can have freedom, that we can be forgiven, and that we can be restored. right? He gives them the story of Nebuchadnezzar and say, this is what you should be doing, but you're not. Even in a sinful world where evil seems to dominate, God is not silent. Do you know that? God's greatness is seen in nature and things, but there's also examples from those who are faithful and humble that live out their lives. There's people we can look to in the past. There's people that we can look to today that we can point to. That we live humble lives as God's worth and way speaks to his majesty and his reign. And you know, God also calls faithful servants, us included, to courageously point to God and the need for all to yield to him. We're part of this God's faithfulness. In faithfully showing the way, he puts us forth to show the way. This is one of the reasons I love the New Testament book of Hebrews. If you ever read through Hebrews, and most of you are familiar with Hebrews chapter 11, it's a whole chapter we call God's Hall of Fame. These heroes of the faith, right, or heroes of faith that trusted God in the midst of things, and God worked in miraculous ways in their lives. And they've experienced his grace and power in and through them. And to these people, the writer of Hebrews points to them as he opens chapter 12, and he says this, therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with an endurance the race that is before us. Isn't that awesome? And he says, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And he's saying, you know what? We have people that we can look to. God raises up people of faith so that we can look to, so that we can keep going, but also so that we can go to our world and say, there is hope. There is a way. And it's only by yielding to God. So that's how God uses Daniel, first of all, in the little story. Then Daniel says, all right, now I'm ready to interpret what you've seen. So in the same way, God uses Daniel's to point Belshazzar to him. And in essence, here's what Daniel's saying to him. You knew what happened in verse 22 and 23. He said, you know what happened to your grandfather, yet you've lifted your heart against the Lord of heaven. You defiled his vessels and honored dead idols and in rebellion against God, the God who gave you life and the God in whose ways are in his hands. You would do well to remember, but you have not, is basically what Daniel's telling him. This is pretty wild, isn't it? And he says, so you haven't? So what I'm about to tell you, you're without excuse. You've seen the way and you haven't yielded. So here's what those words say. And as he points up to those words, right, he says, so it was from God's presence that this hand was sent, and the writing is inscribed, verse 24. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin, or some versions say upharsin. 4 words are on this wall. Now, if we literally translate these words, here's what they mean. Measured, weighed, divided. So even if we know what it says, do we really know what it means? Not really, right? So here's Daniel gives the interpretation in the following verses. And basically he's saying this. And remember, anytime we see words repeated in Scripture back to back like this, it means it's pretty important. So here's what he's basically saying to Belshazzar. You've been measured. In fact, you've been measured twice. God is sure of this. That this measurement is coming to an end. Your life is coming to an end. And so is this empire. You've reached the end. Isn't that wild? Because remember back, this is something else. God is faithful to his promises. Remember back in chapter 2 where he gave that dream with the head, and then underneath of it, the Medo-Persians are going to come in. He's basically saying, this is the fulfillment of that dream right now, the first part of it. So God is faithful to this. So you've been measured. The end is upon you. And then he says, you've been weighed against God, and you've been found wanting. Or you've been found light. Now picture a balance scale, and that's kind of what Daniel's referring to here, and God's referring to, is when you would buy something, they would have the weights of the weight it was, let's say it's a pound, and then you'd have a pound of rice or something, and you put it against it. And if it came up where it was light, you would know, and you would know, that's not a pound, you're cheating me. So that's how they used to weigh things in the balance. Another expression we use today, right? So he says, basically, all of God's worth and goodness and everything he has accomplished is on this side. And you, and all that you think you are, and all your worthiness and your power that you have, it comes up real light. You're nothing compared to God, is basically what he's saying, compared to God and his worth. And he says, therefore, your kingdom will be divided. And here's the word divide, right? He says, it'll be divided this very night between the Medes and the Persians who are standing at the door. Because of your pride, you and your kingdom is going down. Daniel's asked to give some pretty tough messages, isn't he? And yet he gives this message and he's like, this is what it means. Oof. There's no misunderstanding what God is saying here. And it's not good for Belshazzar, is it? But you know what we discover through this message, through this writing on the wall, is also helpful for us as we share the gospel with others, as we take this, as we take the good news to others. And it's this: God faithfully upholds his standard. Remember, God shows the way, but God upholds the standard. And he puts up his standard. God's standard to be worthy of him, to find life in him, and a relationship with him is but one thing. You know what God's standard is? Perfection. It's pretty scary, isn't it? Because I don't know about you. I'm perfect probably 0.0001% of the time. And yet that's God's standard. In fact, on the Sermon on the Mount, that's what Jesus talks about, right? He's talking about all living up to God's standard and resisting sin and loving others like he does. And he says this: you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And you know what? This standard of God never changes. God is faithful in that standard that he puts forth never gets lowered, never gets changed. Why? Because he's a perfect God. How can he and then still be perfect? So God never lowers that standard. It's a standard that no one in and of themselves can measure up to. From the lowliest person to the greatest king, to the weakest person to the most powerful, to the most devout person who would ever live. Nobody can measure up to that. No one can be good enough to be good enough for God. So just like Belshazzar, when we're all measured by God, we fall short. When we're weighed, we come up light, or we come up wanting. Now, you may be sitting here, that's really bad news. And it is. And you know, as bad as it is for us and Belshazzar, there's also some really good news in God's standard. You see, God alone can meet that standard. In fact, because of his love for us, he comes and does meet that standard. That's what Jesus is all about. God in the flesh comes down and he lives out perfection for us, God's standard. And then he says, I give you my life, my perfection, so that every time God looks at you, if you yield yourself to me, to my person and my work and what I've done, if you trust in that alone, every time God looks at you, he's going to look at you through that. And God's going to say, here's my standard perfection. Oh, I see Jesus. You're good. Isn't that awesome? And he gives it as a gift of his love and grace. In fact, that's why Paul talks about, for by grace you've been saved through faith. It's not of your own doing. It's a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one will boast. People like Belshazzar, people that trust in our own goodness, we don't get this. Yet God is faithful in upholding and communicating his standard. And this is something that Belshazzar, he would not do. So as he hears this, he's like, In fact, look how he responds to that in the verses that follow that. He kind of ignores it. And he kind of says, thank you, Daniel. Thanks for what you said. In fact, here's riches and honor. And he gives them and makes them third in the rule. Did he just hear what Daniel said? I don't think so. Isn't that amazing? Sometimes people in our world, and they have warnings of their sin and their own frailty, yet they keep ignoring them. Have you ever been there? So he's ignoring it. And he's in trouble. He's basically in trouble because it kind of seals his fate. Look at verse 30. It says, that very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. God's window to repent for Belshazzar had closed. This great and prideful king over powerful Babylon, he didn't even see morning. He didn't see the sunrise the next day. Could you imagine that? You're going from partying, I'm the king of the world, to where you don't see the sun the next day. In fact, God unleashes his miraculous work that very night. And let me tell you what happened, because this is in the history books of what happens that night at this party. While they're partying, the Persian Empire sits outside the gates. And again, they're not climbing the gates. They're not going through the gate, through the walls. They can't do it. But you know what they do? Cyrus sends some of his men upriver a little bit, up the Euphrates, to where it was divided out. And he has them dam up the part of the river that flowed into Babylon. And miraculously, the river dries up almost immediately, which shouldn't happen. And it's about knee height of water, knee deep. And the Persian army then goes into this knee deep water and goes under the wall into the middle of the city, and they pop out of the riverbed right next to the palace. This entire army is now inside a city, and nobody saw them coming. Imagine that. It's pretty wild, isn't it? So they come in, and the Babylonians, they're overwhelmed. They come out, and they're just like, we're cooked. We surrender. Peace, white flag, all of that, right? And this mighty empire of Babylon falls without a fight. Remember I said that a couple weeks ago, how this was going to happen? This is how it happens. And then they bring out Belshazzar from his party, and they say, who's the king? And he says, I'm the king. And then they put him to death. But yet, because it was such a peaceful transition, because there was no great battle, do you know what happens? All of the rulers and things that were left in Babylon, people like Daniel, their lives were spared. Do you know that? Daniel wasn't killed again. Again, a regime change, but it's peaceful, so Daniel doesn't have to be killed, and God keeps him alive. In fact, God not only spares him, but when Darius comes in, he says, who are the wise men? And he looks at Daniel, and he might even said, hey, I heard about you. You know what he makes Daniel? One of 3 presidents over what Darius rules. One of the leaders over even the Medo-Persian Empire. And Daniel is placed there and spared. This is not only good for Daniel, but it should also encourage us. It should, because we learn something about living in a rebellious world with this too. And it's one final lesson we learn from this passage is that God faithfully preserves those that are his. In the midst of a rebellious world, you know what God says? I got you. In fact, he not only preserves Daniel and his influence, he preserves God's people. Because you know what happens 2 years after this night? 2 years. Under Cyrus, king of Persia, his people are released from captivity to go back to their land and be back home with God. Isn't that cool? So these people in captivity and the strangers in a strange land, God says, now, I've kept you safe so that you can be returned. God faithfully preserves those that are his. And it kind of reminds me of Isaiah. And he actually talked about that in a prophecy. Do you know that? And it's not only for us, but it's not only for the Israelites, it's a promise for us. In Isaiah, he says, fear not, God says, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand, or my powerful hand. Again, this is a promise that we can stand on today, living in a rebellious world. As we seek to live faithfully for God in our world today, that despite the presence of evil, despite those who pridefully stand against God so loudly, and they seemingly prosper, know this, God is always faithful. He's faithful to expose every heart, to show his way, to uphold his standard, so that those who faithfully follow him can be used by him to impact our world. That's why we're here. That's why we're still here in an evil world, because he wants to preserve us to be used by him to impact our world, to set that forth. And you know what? In this, we can have one great thing, hope. We can have hope that God knows what he's doing and he's got us. In fact, in this, we can confidently cling to him in ways and his ways in the midst of a world that opposes him. This is how we live as strangers in a strange land. How we live here in our world today is we cling to him because we know that he's bigger than anything we'll face. We know that his ways are better and that he's always faithful. He's always faithful to save those that yield themselves to him. He's faithful to work and to lead our world from darkness to light. And he wants to use us. So as we close this morning, I'm going to close. I always like to give you one sentence. And in this writing on the wall, here's what God is basically saying in this chapter to teach us about living as strangers in a strange land. And it's this: despite rebellion, God's faithfulness always triumphs. Despite our rebellion, when we rebel against him, God will win. When we see in our world and we say, how can we ever function? How are we going to go on? God, we don't have a voice anymore. We don't have this. It's too much. Despite all of that rebellion, God's faithfulness will always triumph. God will always have use for us as he exposes and shows the way, upholds the standards so that we can lead people to him. That's Daniel chapter 5. Pretty cool, huh? May we walk in that today. Let's pray.